let's talk about Wink Martindale. And Anthony, we were talking before we hit record here. Like, the more I read about him, and I've watched a couple of press conferences as, just kind of doing some different work around here, and he's awesome. He's a football guy. I mean, those of us who follow the NFL have known who he is for a long time. I never thought that he would potentially be a hire at Michigan. And again, it's still potential, but let's talk about his candidacy. The interview going on today at some point here on Thursday. And it's a really interesting one because Mike Macdonald was the linebackers coach under him. Jesse Minter was a secondary coach under Wink Martindale in Baltimore before they both branch out. In 2021, Jesse Minter goes to Vanderbilt, runs that defense. Mike Macdonald comes to Michigan. Minter then comes to Michigan the last 2 seasons. And they were all running the same system, essentially. Obviously, different variations. They all have their own personality as a play caller, but he ran the Baltimore defense for 4 seasons, was let go after the 2021 campaign. That's when Mike Macdonald headed back to Baltimore to run that defense. But, him and John Harbaugh both kind of said it was time. They struggled a little bit. They had a lot of injuries that season. But they were top 3 in the NFL in scoring defense his first 3 years as their D coordinator. They finished 26th in his final year, but again, had a ton of injuries that year. Marcus Peters, Deshaun Elliott, Marlon Humphrey were all hurt at different points in the year, and a couple other guys as well. Then he goes on to the New York Giants, brings a couple guys with him as well that we can talk about who may also join him at Michigan. They have some success in year 1. This past year didn't go as well. Him and Brian Daboll, the head coach, kind of clashed a little bit. And that led to his exit, which was, pretty much him resigning from the New York Giants. And, Daboll, from what you read, is kind of a tough guy to work with. And I'm sure, there are 2 sides to that story as well. So it's not like it's nothing to talk about that they had that clash. But I guess your initial thoughts on Wink Martindale.
I would like it if they're able to get it done. I mean, this is, and again, just like anything, there are polarizing opinions on it, namely on, again, not calling them out, just our message board. There's a lot of people, a lot of opinions on there. Feel free to use that promo below to get in on that as well. But when you talk to football people, specifically people who covered Wink with the Ravens and with the Giants, I think a lot of people see that as a fit, especially given what Michigan has run the last few years. And there's been, now again, the differences between what Macdonald and Minter were running and what Wink likes to run is, it seems like it is a little more man-to-man, and somehow the narrative on our board emerged that it would be like hiring Don Brown again. It's not. It's nothing like that. In fact, if you go through and look at some of the, you look at some of the man versus zone stuff, some of the games the Giants have played over these last few years, there has been a lot of zone mixed in. And it's, I would say, talk about hiring someone with the tenets of that Michigan defense. Now, Macdonald and Minter ran a variation of what Wink was running in Baltimore under John Harbaugh. And there was a parting of ways because in the NFL that happens. Teams figure you out and you got to adjust. And sometimes you're looking for a different voice. And that's why, anyone who thinks that he's a retread type of guy, no, it's just the NFL is brutal. It's cutthroat. It's one of the reasons why Jim Harbaugh is being kind of ruthless in hiring his staff, because you don't have much of a win. If you don't win in the NFL at the highest level, your window to be there isn't as long as it might be somewhere else. So for me, Wink Martindale, again, it's not, stop short of calling him, the godfather of the defense that Michigan wants to run. But I think it's a guy that fits. I think when you have a first-time head coach, especially a guy who is from an offensive background, I like having a guy with experience and gravitas, essentially being the head coach of his side of the ball. So for me, I would have a hard time. Would have a hard time really criticizing this one, especially with all the personnel they have coming back. I would think you would still be pliable enough in terms of scheme, in terms of what you want to run to work around your players. And Michigan's got a lot of pretty darn good ones coming back, assuming everyone comes back, with the portal windows open and whatnot. So for me, again, stop short of calling anything a home run. I don't think there is such thing as a home run hire. There is no one-to-one replacement or plug in for anyone else. But to me, I think given your timeline, given where you're at, I think it would make a lot of sense.
I think there are home run hires, but you don't really find out until they hit the field in the fall. And, I think that's going to be the case with this Michigan staff. Sharon Moore promoting different guys, analysts like JB Brown to special teams coordinator. Like, you can't really judge a hire like that until they get out in the field. Same with Grant Newsome moving from tight ends to offensive line. It seems like a natural fit. I mean, Jim Harbaugh even talked last year about how, hey, he's going to be the O-line coach one day. He's going to be the offensive coordinator after that. We're going to keep promoting him until we can't promote him anymore. That was certainly something that was going to be in the works at some point, whether Sharon Moore went on to be a head coach somewhere else and they needed an O-line coach, or whether they're in the need for one now because he is now the head coach at Michigan. That stuff is seems natural, seems like good fits, but you don't know it until they get on the field. A couple things about Wink's defenses. One that you really like and that shows a lot of similarity to what Michigan has done, of course, because the guys that were running Michigan's defense the last few years came from his system, but they rank much higher in scoring defense than they do in total defense. They're going to allow you to get some yards in between the 20s, but they're going to be stingy in the red zone, kind of the bend, don't break type of scheme that Michigan runs, especially one that you need against Ohio State that we've seen work so well the last 3 years. The one that we saw on full display in the national championship game against Washington when, they kept everything in front. They only allowed one pass play of 20-plus yards, and that was for 44 yards in the fourth quarter when Michigan had a big enough lead anyway. So that sort of stuff, the stuff that we talked so much about under Jesse Minter and Mike McDonald, I think can stay intact. They finished top 3 in the NFL in scoring defenses first 3 years as the DC of the Ravens. Again, slipped a little bit in year 4, a lot of injuries. Offense wasn't good either at different times. A year later, they end up replacing Greg Roman with Todd Monken from Georgia. And it's kind of the same situation. They just needed a different voice. Like you said, I think that's a great word to use. And they go with Todd Monken out of Georgia. It doesn't mean Greg Roman wasn't a good offensive coordinator. Jim Harbaugh, John's brother, just hired him as the OC at Los Angeles. So just because there was a parting of the ways there, just because things kind of went down like they did in New York, doesn't mean that that he's damaged goods or anything like that. I mean, he's been around the NFL for a long time, coordinated multiple defenses going back to 15 years ago when he was the coordinator with the Broncos. But that's one thing that stood out to me. And then the second thing that stands out to me when you do some research on his defenses is this guy likes to blitz. So maybe in that respect, he's a little bit like Don Brown, but I don't think the comparison is really that apt. But in 2018, they ranked first in blitz rate. In 2019, they're first. In 2020, they're first. 2021, they were 8th. I don't know what happened there, down to 31.1%. Then with the Giants in 2022, first in the league in blitz rate. In 2023, second in the league in blitz rate. So he likes to bring pressure. They run simulated pressure as well. Some of the stuff, exotic stuff that we saw specifically under Jesse Minter, who, which I loved and thought was huge and really helped confuse opposing offensive lines. But, I think those things are all kind of positives. And like our Chris Ballas wrote this morning, he's going to have to adapt to the college game, right? And he's probably going to be willing to do that and understand what he's going to need to do in the college game to win. And I guess that leads me to this question for you, AB. Is he 60 years old? He hasn't been in college since 2003 when he was coaching a couple years before that and with Jack Harbaugh at Western Kentucky. So the Harbaugh ties run that deep. But your thoughts on him having to recruit, on him having to adapt to a different level of football that he hasn't been in over 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to recruiting, I've always felt, and I know depending on the guy, like our recruiting guys might push back on this, but I've always felt like recruiting is just communication and relating to people and having a vision to sell for the guys that come into your program. So again, I don't know Wink's background enough to know if he would be successful in that area. I think, like I said before, there is like a presence and gravitas that he would bring to him. I
mean, look at him. Look at the sunglasses.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing right here. If you're watching the video, the B-roll itself, how do you recruit to Michigan? He's wearing a Baltimore Ravens hat and a New York Giants hat. And I know the Giants haven't been, what they were maybe in those, with, historically, but that a guy that's been successful, and really Giants people will tell you kind of was the reason that team was kept afloat over the last 2 years, given that offense hasn't been all that great there. So again, how's he going to recruit? What kind of staff would he fill out around him? Listen, I mean, I'll just say this about Wink is if he winds up being the guy, I think ideally what happens from there is that you have a younger group of position coaches around him. It's not at all unlike what we've seen at Michigan the last few years. You get someone to eat, sleep, and breathe that defense and kind of be his right-hand man. And then you pass it off in a year or two. Because again, if there is I know this has kind of been the narrative with the head coach, but if there's an NFL opportunity that he wants, I assume Wink Martindale would probably leave and take it. So it kind of goes against what I said earlier about not grabbing a name and not just worrying about 2024. But this would be the case where I think you can afford to plan ahead by surrounding him with guys that you see having that trajectory of being that play caller. And we'll talk about, what that means for Steve Klingscale here in a bit. But I know if it's Wink, again, you talk about how sometimes you need a different look and you need a different voice on your defense too. And make no mistake about it. You prefer to have Mike McDonald or Jesse Minter still around. But at the same time, they have what? I have to do math here really quick. 28 plus 15. If teams have 43 games, 43 games of film on this Michigan defense now from over the last few years. And, it's every offseason. You got to go in and add some kind of tweak and make yourself, adjustment proof, so to speak. So certainly adjustments that can be made, certainly adjustments that likely will be made. And again, this isn't, you kind of have to hit the ground running here too, because you're not going to have 9 weeks of run up until you play a game that matters next year. You got Texas in week 2. You're going to play Oregon. You're going to play USC. You're going to play Ohio State. You're going to go play at Washington. It's not, this is where I'm kind of on board with keeping that continuity there in terms of what you do defensively for just 2024. I think I'm okay with that. What happens after next year, we'll see. But in terms of keeping that nucleus intact, I think that Wink right now, given everything we know about what's out there, is probably your best shot at that. And it's not going to look the same, but I think it will look similar enough, should look similar enough to keep guys happy that we're maybe considering looking around or what have you.
Yeah, I think once he gets in a room with some of these guys, and our Chris Ballas reported over on the Wolverine.com this morning that I think that's even going to happen maybe in the interview process where they let some of these guys, meet some of the guys who are interviewing and, understand what the potential vision and what the potential fit would be like, what the personality is like. And I think that's smart. And that's not uncommon. I don't think either, but it's something that I think Sharon Moore wants to do. And I think that is smart. And look, Wink is, he's 60 years old. He's kind of an old school guy. He blitzes a lot, but he is a player's coach from everything that you read. He let NFL players at both the Giants and the Ravens call the defense during some preseason games. Like, this is a guy who loves his players. I was just watching a press conference of him talking about the guys on his defense that made the made All-Pro in the Pro Bowl this past year, how proud he is of them, like, the growth that they've had. Like, this is a guy that is going to relate to the players. Just because he's on the older side, it does not mean that he's not going to at all. So I think that could be a real plus. And I want to go back to what you mentioned. I thought that was really interesting with, this may be a guy who would get another NFL opportunity. And look, I think the Cowboys are looking at him right now too for the defensive coordinator job. So it's not a slam dunk that Michigan's able to land him. But again, we're talking about a potential hire here where, let's say he does have a good 2 years at Michigan. If he does come here and run the defense and gets a call from another NFL team, which is certainly possible. He's been a coordinator now for, several straight seasons and many in the NFL throughout his tenure. You have guys that will be around, continue to run this defense. If Klink's here next year, it's year 4 of him in this system. And the next year would be year 5 and things like that. You have those guys. We also talked about a week ago when Mike McDonald got the head coaching job of the Seahawks, how it makes it tougher to hire a defensive coordinator because he got that job. He's looking for one. Jim was looking for one, took Minter as expected. John had to promote from within to get his D coordinator. Like, it limited some of the candidate pool for Michigan. But now with all these different head coaches out there, Jim, John, McDonald, Sharon Moore running this defense, there are going to be other candidates to potentially bring in if you do lose a guy. And I know this defense is kind of becoming the hot thing in the NFL, but that is something that could benefit them down the road. So you want to keep this defense because it's been so successful, and it's kind of the thing right now. And I think there are going to be more candidates down the road, if you look at it in the future, for Michigan to choose from.
Well, think of it too. I mean, you've almost got it's different, right? I think I put Mike McDonald in more of the Ravens tree than I do the Michigan tree, but he did have that 1 year there. And it's kind of like coast to coast, you kind of have like this spreading of the, I call it a plague or a disease that is the Michigan, that style of defense. So
it's a disease for offenses. Yeah.
Yes, you've got a foothold now in the nation's capital. You've got the foothold in Ann Arbor. You've got Pacific Northwest covered with Mike McDonald in Seattle. You've got Harbaugh now out there with the Chargers. So, again, it's why I don't necessarily, just looking at all of these hires so far in general, especially when you look at guys like Steve Kasula, JB Brown, those are all like, the reason to be optimistic about hires like that is because those are guys that have been here and that Jim Harbaugh had a direct hand in either hiring or mentoring and signing off on them being around. So, the key thing for Sharon, as we've said, is he's got to run the program the way he wants to. But there's also a lot, what we've seen over the last few years is like this steady line of succession sort of built from the analysts, from the grad assistants to position coaches, into coordinators, into guys that are head coaches now. I mean, Jesse Minter, if he has a good year with the Chargers, maybe he's an NFL head coach this time next year. So continuing to keep that line of succession going, and how you tie this back to Wink, it's a guy with gravitas that sets a tone, that mentors a bunch of younger and hungry guys, and everyone kind of gets dispersed. Like, ideally, that's how this works here moving forward. And I don't know. It could just be, if it's Wink, it could just be a Band-Aid for 1 year. We don't know. But ideally, that's sort of the direction that this heads here, is that, you keep you can't replicate a Jim Harbaugh, but you can replicate the culture and sort of the setup of putting talented people in roles and elevating them when it's time to succeed. And maybe something Michigan can improve on is keeping and retaining some of those people moving forward. But that's a conversation for another day. Right now, we'll see what happens with the rest of this staff. But if it's Wink, I think that's a really solid hire. About the best hire you could probably make right now.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And, part of the exit in New York was that Brian Dable kind of went behind Wink's back and fired outside linebackers coach Drew Wilkins and his brother, defensive assistant Kevin Wilkins, and told Martindale that. I guess that was a pretty heated meeting, according to a really good report from The Athletic. There were some, colorful words exchanged, I believe. And, that kind of led to Wink wanting out there. But I think those are guys that could follow him to Michigan from what we've heard, and, could be guys that would help fill out this defensive staff.